Hello. Hopefully you have already undertaken the research tasks on King Arthur and have watched the videos, so you are aware of the plot of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This video is intended to give you an introduction to the text itself and some background. Before we look at a translated version of the text by the poet Simon Armitage, here is a brief introduction to Middle English. Before Shakespeare, English had been slowly developing for 500 years. A lot of people believe that Shakespeare wrote in Old English. He did not. He used what we now call Early Modern English, and before this, the people in England and large parts of Wales spoke in a type of English called Middle English. Middle English emerged in the period between the year 1100 and 1400, and texts were being written in this style from approximately 1150 until around 1450. At this time, English was changing rapidly. Old English, which we will study in 2 weeks' time, was blended into a language that was influenced by Scandinavian languages from Norway, Sweden and Denmark, as well as Latin and French. Sir Gawain is a useful text for examining this. Let's look at the first two lines of the text in the original Middle English. Seethen the siege and the assault were seized at Troia, the bore Britain and brent the Brondes and Askes. Now, in modern English, this was translated as, once the siege and assault at Troy had ceased, with the city a smoke heap of cinders and ash, and is part of the first sentence. All the words in the second line come from Old English, which is similar to modern Icelandic. The first line is full of French words. The words siege and assault are from French, and so is the word sieged. As you can see, there is clear evidence of how English was becoming increasingly diverse. The story that the poet was referring to here came from ancient Greece. There was no standard spelling in English at this time, there was no standard dictionary, and there were lots of different dialects all across the country. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was written by a poet, whose name we don't know, who lived in what is now the northwest of England. The poet seems to have been familiar with what is now Liverpool in North Wales, and chose to set their story of King Arthur in this part of the country. The structure of the poem, which is written like a story, a sort of longer ballad in fact, is very unusual. The story is organised into chapters called fits, and has long stanzas, some of which rhyme. The poet uses a lot of alliterative sounds in the poem, which makes the poem sound magical. At the end of each section there is a short mini-stanza, which is connected to the long stanza with a short sentence followed by a stanza of 4 lines, which rhymes very strictly. This is called a bob and wheel, and was popular in religious songs at this time in history. As you will remember from studying ballads, ballads are a narrative poem. They're a poem that tell a story, and they were often set to music, so it's possible that this poem may have been set to music as well. Let's have a look at an extract from the poem. Watch closely, as your final task this week will be to annotate a second extract to send to your teacher. This is the section from when Sir Gawain is about to leave Camelot and go on his fateful encounter with the Green Knight. And it says, "Then they showed him the shining scarlet shield, with its pentangle painted in pure gold. He seized it by its strap and slung it around his neck. He looked well in what he wore and was worthy of it. And why the pentangle was appropriate to that prince I intend to say, though it will stall our story. It is a symbol that Solomon once set in place, and is taken to this day as a token of fidelity. For the form of the figure is a 5-pointed star, and each line overlaps and links with the last, and so is ever eternal, and when spoken of in England is known by the name of the endless knot. So it suits this soldier in his spotless armour, fully faithful in 5 ways 5 times over. For Sir Gawain was as good as the purest gold, devoid of vices, but virtuous, loyal, and kind, and so bore that badge on both his shield and shawl alike, a prince who told the truth, a notable a knight. I'll just extend that to the bottom there. So you can see the structure is slightly similar to a modern poem, but at the same time there are differences. The long stanza here is quite conversational. It almost sounds chatty, like the poet is having a conversation with the people, their audience, and the people that are listening to them. At the bottom here we've got this little section that, as you can see, is connected to the rest of it by this part of the sentence here. So this is our bob, this section, and this is our wheel. I just thought that term came from weaving and was borrowed by a writer in the 1950s actually. Now let's have a look at the extract and let's have a look at what it's trying to tell us. Now obviously when we look at poetry you have to be very careful to make sure that you identify not just the techniques but why the techniques are being used. So let's start at the top of this section and work our way down. As you can see, we can see the alliterative sounds. Now the truly alliterative sounds are these ones, that sh sound. So they showed him the shining scarlet shield. Well, if we think about scarlet, that's a red colour. Red has lots of different connotations. So the poet might have chosen to use a scarlet shield because, well, let's think of it, it might be love. It can also be danger. Red is quite a strong, quite a powerful colour. So maybe there's these considerations. It's pentangle painted in pure gold. Now pentangles, as you can see from the word, pent meaning 5 and angle meaning any kind of inflection, angle or shape, painted in pure gold. So now all of a sudden we have more colour imagery. We have gold. Now this is normally the point where I would ask members of the class what gold is associated with, but as you already know, it's associated with wealth and status, people of a high status in society perhaps, with beauty as well. So we can see that Gawain is an important person from the way that he dresses. We know that he's important to King Arthur, we know that he's important to the court, and what we have of course here, as I said a moment ago, is colour imagery. Now obviously in a poem called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I think it's pretty obvious that colour imagery would be an important thing to look for. So let's carry on down the poem. He seized it by his strap and slung it around his neck. Now that's interesting. Slung. Slung is a very interesting verb choice, because that to me sounds a bit careless, a little bit casual perhaps. So maybe we're starting to change our opinion of Sir Gawain slightly. It builds us up to the end of course where he thinks he's disappointed King Arthur. Maybe he's a more careless and a more casual character than we thought he originally was. Now this is where the narrator suddenly jumps into the poem, as it does quite often throughout the text, and why the pentangle was appropriate to that prince I intend to say it will restore our story. And this is the first thing I tell people not to do in essays, is to say things like I. But why is he doing it here? Well, this is a poem that was to be performed. The person who's reading the poem is performing it as well. And it's important because if we look at the next line, the symbol that Solomon once set in place, now this refers to the Bible, which an audience at that time in history would have known very, very well. And if you don't know this, you don't know perhaps who Solomon was or what comes up in the section you're going to be given, maybe have a look, do some research and find out who this person was. Now, Solomon was a biblical king, so again we have ideas here of kingship, power. Now it's taken to this day as a token of fidelity. See the T sounds repeating again. A token of fidelity. This means faithfulness and honesty. So even Gawain's clothing is demonstrating how brave and how loyal he is, not just to King Arthur, but all the vows that he has made as a knight. The form of the figure is a 5-pointed star. Well, again, let's have a look at more. This here, we've got lots and lots here of symbolism, lots of symbols. Now, stars, of course, we think of stars guiding people. We think perhaps of space. We think of fate. People often talk about it being written in the stars, and when you study Romeo and Juliet in year 11, stars are about fate and events over which characters have no control. Maybe that's exactly the same here with Sir Gawain. Each line overlaps and links with the last, and so is ever eternal. Now again, think about the idea of eternity as well. Gawain at this point beheaded the Green Knight and is, perhaps thinking about his place. He is told by the Green Knight to come to the castle to find out, to receive the same punishment as he inflicted upon the knight. So maybe, we're thinking about mortality, perhaps an end of something. These are all ideas that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight deal with as a text as well. So maybe you want to think about, are there bigger themes that the poet is writing about? And when spoken of in England is known by the name of the endless knot. Now that's very interesting as well, because there's something of an oxymoron here, a contradiction in terms. Can you have an endless knot? Is such a thing possible? Well, again, and maybe therefore, if Gawain is wearing an endless knot, which is impossible, maybe his own ideas of being a knight are impossible. Maybe people have flaws. No one is perfect. So maybe this is Gawain living up to a standard that's too high for him. Again, these symbols are very, very interesting. This idea of symbolism that we talked about earlier is a very interesting thing to look for in poems of this length and plays. So it suits this soldier in his spotless armour. Again, more ideas about being perfect. Now, if you have something come up in a text, it's a repeated pattern of images. It's called a motif. And this idea of eternity, endlessness, spotlessness is all about perfection. So maybe it's a bit messy, but if we link the idea of symbolism and perfection, we have lots of symbols about being perfect. It says Gawain was as good as the purest gold. Now look at this. We have ourselves a superlative. The purest gold, not just pure gold, the purest possible gold we would wish to have. Now that's, of course, a simile as well. You may have heard this, parents saying it's always as good as gold. Well, this is what the poet is trying to emphasise to us here, that Gawain is this idea of perfection as a knight. Devoid of vices, that's a bit wordy, but that basically means that he had no negative character traits whatsoever, or so we think. None whatsoever. And of course we find out at the end that that's not true. He is only human. Devoid of vices, virtuous, loyal, kind, so bore that badge on both his shield and shawl alike. So he's wearing this twice. He's wearing it not just on his shield, which again, if you think about it, has connotations of fighting, conflict. So maybe there'll be more conflict to come in the story. We know there is, of course. A prince who talks the truth. Wow. So now Gawain has been elevated. He's been made even higher up than a knight. He's a prince. Now if you think about that, that has connotations of royalty, which is impressive. So this section here, the wheel section, as we talked about the bob and wheel earlier, the wheel section is really emphasising Gawain's virtue, his goodness, his ability to make good decisions and do the right thing. A prince who talks the truth, a notable, a knight. I like this word notable as well. I think Simon Armitage, who translated it, is such an excellent way with words. he's talking about here, he's famous in his own right. He's independently famous, which I suppose you would be if you have a story named after you. But look at this, we have here as well, you may have noticed as I'm speaking, you probably did, that we have a triplet, or a rule of three, depending on how you wish to speak of it. And that's another thing, that really this is odd in a poem in some ways, because this is a persuasive technique. Now, why on earth would our poet be using a persuasive technique? Well, they're trying to persuade their audience in the same way you would in a persuasive piece of writing. They're trying to convince us that Gawain is this great knight, this sort of beacon of virtue, this great man who's willingly going to his death. At this point, he's prepared to follow his ideals and his values so closely that he is willing to lose his own life. So this is, you know, this triplet at the end here, and these symbols and this emphasis that's being given throughout the poem are not accidental. They're very clear, very deliberate in this attempt to emphasise Gawain's virtue. And then if we go back up the poem again and we look at this section and why the pentangle was appropriate to that prince, I intend to say, though it will stall our story. And again, the alliteration here almost emphasises, again, it's not relevant to the story what he was wearing, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I'm going to take some time out from the actual story and look closely at Gawain and this symbol that links him to royalty with King Solomon being a prince. This soldier in his spotless armour, this knight. So all these values, all these ideas are emphasised about Gawain and to show how great he is. So as a reader, we're sort of lulled into a false sense of security. We think, well, Gawain is perfect, Gawain is brilliant. We're obviously hearing this story because Gawain is this perfect example of a knight, this perfect example of a man, and this perfect example of someone who's prepared to sacrifice what they believe. And of course, we're disappointed by that. So all this stuff that's going on here in the second fit, as you can see, the second chapter of the story is supposed to emphasise not only the fact that Gawain is perfect, but that no one can be perfect in its own odd way. So if we do a quick summary then of all the poetic techniques we've found, we've not only got this repeated alliteration that goes on throughout the poem, we have lots of symbolism. We have lots of symbols of things that are supposed to help us to understand Gawain's virtue, how virtuous he is, how moral, how good. And we see this in the last stanza as well. It's emphasised, using the bob and wheel here for emphasis, to demonstrate how great Sir Gawain is. We've got other things as well. We've got oxymoron, we've got a triplet, and these things are supposed to emphasise not only how great Gawain is, but the impossibility of being perfect. Now, it's not really possible to be this great valiant knight that Sir Gawain is being hyped to be. So hopefully that gives you some understanding of the text and this style of poetry. Your task will be to look at one of these in the same way and make some notes, and not just notes saying which technique they are, but also why they've been used by the poet. Expand your ideas wherever you possibly can. I hope that's been useful. I look forward to seeing your responses to the task.